Hey guys, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to an era that, let's just say, wasn't exactly a picnic for certain segments of the population. We're talking about a period where even your words could get you into a rather uncomfortable situation. So let's begin with a rather peculiar and, frankly, quite unsettling little invention from the annals of history, the Scold's Bridle. Now, you might be thinking, what in the world is a Scold's Bridle? And that's a perfectly valid question, especially since it sounds like something you'd put on a horse that's been particularly sassy. And in a way, you wouldn't be entirely wrong about the intention behind it. But instead of horses, we're talking about women. Specifically, women who, according to the prevailing sensibilities of the time, had a bit too much to say. Imagine, if you will, a contraption of iron, not a decorative piece, mind you, but something designed for a very specific and rather unpleasant purpose. The Scold Bridle, also known as the brank, was essentially a metal muzzle. It consisted of an iron framework that enclosed the head with a special plate, often spiked, that would press down on the tongue. The idea, as you can probably guess, was to prevent the wearer from speaking. Because, of course, a woman who spoke too much, or spoke out of turn, or simply voiced an opinion that wasn't well received was deemed a scold or a common brawler. And naturally, such behavior simply couldn't be tolerated. This wasn't some isolated one-off invention by a particularly grumpy husband. Oh no, the Scold's Bridle was a legitimate, legally recognized form of public humiliation and punishment, particularly prevalent in Britain and Scotland from the 16th to the early 19th centuries. So we're not talking about a fleeting trend. This was a persistent feature of social control for a good few hundred years. And while it might seem incredibly harsh to us now, back then it was just another tool in the arsenal for maintaining social order, particularly when it came to keeping women in their proper place. Now, let's be clear, the definition of a scold was pretty broad and, as you can imagine, incredibly subjective. It wasn't just about yelling or using foul language, although those were certainly covered. A woman could be accused of scolding for gossiping, for arguing with her husband, for criticizing her neighbors, or even for just generally having a spirited personality that was deemed unruly. Essentially, if a woman dared to be assertive or opinionated in a way that challenged male authority, she ran the risk of being labeled a scold. Because why listen to a woman's perspective when you can just silence her entirely? The process usually began with a complaint, often from a husband, a neighbor, or even a local official. These complaints would then be brought before local magistrates or church courts, and while there might have been some semblance of a trial, the cards were pretty stacked against the accused. After all, the very act of bringing a complaint often carried enough weight to suggest guilt. Once convicted, the punishment would often involve being paraded through the streets in the bridle, sometimes even chained to a market cross or a post for all to see. The public spectacle was a crucial element of the punishment, designed not only to humiliate the woman, but also to serve as a warning to others. See what happens, the message seemed to be, if you dare to step out of line. The physical discomfort of the bridle itself was one thing. Imagine having a heavy iron contraption strapped to your head with a metal plate pressing down on your tongue, making speech impossible and swallowing difficult. It would have been excruciating. But the psychological impact, the sheer public shame and degradation, was arguably even more profound. To be paraded like an animal, unable to defend yourself or even utter a sound, would have been deeply traumatizing. It stripped women of their voice, their dignity, and their standing in the community. It was a clear and unambiguous message about who held power and who was expected to be silent. The Scold's bridle wasn't just a physical restraint, it was a symbol of patriarchal control, a stark reminder of the limitations placed on women's autonomy and expression in a society that often viewed their words with suspicion and their opinions as threats. It really highlights the prevailing attitudes towards women during this period, where their primary role was often seen as subservient, and their voices were to be heard only when sanctioned, and even then, quietly. It's interesting to note that while the Scold's bridle was primarily associated with women, there are occasional records of men being subjected to similar punishments, although these instances were far less common. For men, public shaming usually involved the pillory or the stocks, which, while certainly humiliating, didn't specifically target the act of speaking in the same way the bridle did. The specific focus on women and their scolding suggests a societal anxiety about female outspokenness and the perceived disruption it could cause to the established social order, because, heaven forbid, a woman might have an opinion that wasn't approved of by the men in charge. Let's think about the practicality of this. A community, often small and tightly knit, would witness this spectacle. It wasn't just about punishing one individual, it was about sending a very clear message to everyone else. It was a performance of power, a public declaration of who was in control and what the consequences were for defying those controls. And the consequences, as we've established, were not just physical discomfort, but the complete destruction of one's reputation. Once labeled a scold and publicly humiliated, it would have been incredibly difficult for a woman to regain her standing in the community. It was a scarlet letter, but one made of iron and designed to silence. The descriptions of these devices often vary slightly, reflecting local craftsmanship and perhaps even the particular inclinations of the person commissioning them. Some bridles were relatively plain, while others might have been more elaborate, perhaps even featuring decorative elements, which honestly just adds another layer of grim irony to the whole thing. Imagine being subjected to such a cruel punishment, and it's been accessorized? Because why not add a bit of flourish to your instruments of torture, right? The decline of the Scold's bridle as a form of punishment coincided with broader social and legal reforms, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. As society evolved and ideas about justice and human rights slowly began to shift, the extreme cruelty and public humiliation associated with the bridle started to be viewed with increasing distaste. It gradually fell out of favor, replaced by other, less overtly barbaric forms of punishment. Though, of course, the journey towards true equality and respect for women's voices was, and still is, a very long one. But the very existence of the Scold's bridle serves as a potent reminder of a time when the power of a woman's voice was literally seen as something that needed to be forcibly restrained. So, as you can see, the history of communication, especially for women, is filled with these little nuggets of, well, let's just call them challenges. The Scold's bridle is a stark, metallic example of how societies have historically attempted to control and define acceptable behavior, particularly for women. And while it might seem like a relic from a distant, unenlightened past, the echoes of such attitudes, the subtle and not so subtle ways in which women's voices are still sometimes undervalued or dismissed, can unfortunately still be heard today. Let's now shift our gaze gently, of course, from the literal silencing of women to some other fascinating and often equally troubling aspects of royal life and elite life during these times. Because if you thought the general population had it rough, sometimes being at the top of the social ladder came with its own unique set of, let's call them quirks and complications. And often these quirks and complications stemmed from one very specific and historically prolific practice, inbreeding. Because when you're a royal and your primary goal is to keep that bloodline pure, sometimes you end up with a family tree that looks less like a tree and more like a very tightly wound genetic pretzel. we're going to be delving into the delightful world of hereditary succession and the lengths to which royal families would go to maintain their power, often at a significant genetic cost. So let's float over to the concept of the most inbred monarchs in European history, because frankly, there were quite a few of them, and their stories are a fascinating, if sometimes a little tragic, testament to the unintended consequences of trying to keep it all in the family. Now, before we get too deep into the specific individuals, let's just briefly touch upon why this was such a pervasive issue. For millennia, and especially in aristocratic and royal circles, marriage wasn't primarily about love or even companionship. Oh no, it was political. It was about alliances, about securing borders, about inheriting lands, and most importantly, about continuing the dynasty. And to keep the power consolidated, to ensure that the crown stayed within the proper lineage, marrying cousins or even closer relatives became not just acceptable, but often actively encouraged, because, wouldn't want those pesky commoners getting ideas about joining the family, would you? The prevailing understanding of genetics at the time was, let's say, another example of a royal child whose life was overshadowed by ill health and an early demise is Louis XVII of France, the son of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Now, we're jumping forward a bit in time here, but the themes of vulnerability and tragic fate remain consistent. Louis XVII was born in 1785, and his early childhood was spent in the lap of luxury, surrounded by the opulence of the French court at Versailles. He was known as the Dauphin, the heir apparent to the French throne, and was adored by his parents and the court. But his life took a dramatic and tragic turn with the French Revolution. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of the end for the French monarchy. The royal family was eventually imprisoned, and the young Dauphin, along with his parents and sister, was confined to the Temple Tower. Imagine being a child, ripped from a life of privilege and thrown into a cramped, dismal prison cell, watching your world crumble around you. His father, Louis XVI, was executed in 1793, followed shortly after by his mother, Marie Antoinette. At the age of 8, Louis XVII was formally separated from his sister and aunt and placed in the care of a shoemaker named Antoine Sfaiman, a staunch revolutionary. The intention was to re-educate the young prince, to strip him of his royal identity and indoctrinate him into revolutionary ideals. And the methods used were, to put it mildly, brutal. He was subjected to neglect, abuse, and deliberate attempts to break his spirit. He was forced to denounce his parents, taught revolutionary songs, and encouraged to drink alcohol. His living conditions were appalling, and he was often left alone in squalor. The bright, cheerful boy of Versailles rapidly deteriorated, becoming withdrawn, emaciated, and suffering from a multitude of ailments, including scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, skin diseases, and malnutrition. It's a truly heartbreaking story of a child being deliberately destroyed for political purposes. Louis XVII died in the Temple Tower on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, but it's clear that his demise was greatly hastened by the horrific conditions and abuse he endured during his imprisonment. His body was hastily buried in a common grave, and for years rumors persisted that he had somehow escaped and that another child had been buried in his place. But scientific analysis of a preserved heart, believed to be his, has largely confirmed his identity. His story is a powerful and deeply disturbing example of what could happen to royal children when the tides of political fortune turned against them. He was not just a sickly child, he was a pawn in a brutal political game, stripped of his family, his dignity, and ultimately, his life. And all of this for simply being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. It makes you think twice about wanting to be a prince, doesn't it? The gilded cage could very quickly turn into a literal prison. So, while tales of medieval royalty often conjure images of opulent castles and lavish banquets, the reality for many royal children was far more grim. They were either sickly and vulnerable to the myriad diseases of the era, or they were pawns in political games, their destinies dictated by forces far beyond their control. And sometimes, as in the case of Louis XVII, they were both. A life of privilege, but also a life of profound risk and vulnerability. Let's now, with a gentle transition, drift over to another aspect of royal life that often gets a bit messy. We're talking about every time royal marriages went genetically wrong. Because, as we've already touched upon with the Habsburgs, the quest for dynastic purity and political alliance often led to some rather unfortunate genetic consequences. But it wasn't just about the Habsburg jaw. Sometimes it was about a whole host of other issues that plagued these tightly interconnected royal families. Because when you keep marrying your cousins, eventually something's gonna give. And often that something was the health and well-being of the unfortunate offspring. We've already discussed Charles II of Spain, the poster child for royal inbreeding, but his story is just one of many. The problem of consanguinity, or marrying within the same bloodline, was widespread across European royalty for centuries. It was a practice rooted in the desire to preserve wealth, power, and titles, and to prevent these assets from falling into the hands of rival families, or, perish the thought, commoners. Because in their minds, keeping the royal blood pure was paramount, even if it meant risking a few genetic hiccups along the way. Or, in some cases, a complete genetic catastrophe. The medical understanding of inherited diseases was, as you can imagine, virtually non-existent during these periods. They might have observed that certain conditions ran in families, but the underlying mechanisms were a complete mystery. So when a royal child was born with a particular ailment or disability, it was often attributed to divine displeasure, a curse, or simply bad luck, rather than the more prosaic explanation of, well, their parents were first cousins and their grandparents were also cousins, because why attribute it to genetics when you can blame it on an angry god? One of the most famous examples of a devastating genetic disorder that plagued several European royal families, particularly those descended from Queen Victoria, is hemophilia. This is a bleeding disorder where the blood doesn't clot properly, leading to spontaneous bleeding and prolonged bleeding after injury or surgery. It's a debilitating and often life-threatening condition, and it's spread through the royal houses of Europe like wildfire, earning it the ominous nickname the royal disease. The story of hemophilia in European royalty begins with Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She was a carrier of the hemophilia gene, meaning she didn't suffer from the disease herself, as it primarily affects males, but she could pass it on to her children, and she passed it on. Two of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, also became carriers, and her son, Leopold, Duke of Albany, suffered from the disease himself. Because, of course, if you're going to have a genetic mutation, why not have it be one that has profound and deadly consequences? Through the marriages of Victoria's children and grandchildren, hemophilia spread to the royal families of Spain, Germany, and most famously, Russia. It's a truly fascinating and tragic example of how a single genetic mutation, through its profound impact on the life of one young boy, could inadvertently contribute to the collapse of an entire empire. Talk about a butterfly effect, with a lot more internal bleeding. The tragic end of the Romanovs, including the execution of Alexei along with his entire family in 1918 during the Russian Revolution, adds another layer of sorrow to this story. He was a child who never had a chance to live a normal life, constantly battling a debilitating illness and ultimately caught in the brutal political maelstrom of his time. His story is a powerful and deeply disturbing reminder of how deeply personal genetic conditions can become intertwined with the grand narratives of history, influencing political decisions, shaping reputations, and ultimately determining destinies. Let's now, with our usual gentle drift, consider another aspect of royal marriages going genetically wrong, beyond the obvious physical ailments. We're talking about the subtler but no less impactful psychological and intellectual consequences that could arise from generations of inbreeding, because sometimes the issues weren't immediately visible, but manifested in ways that affected temperament, decision-making, and even sanity. And in a monarch, these issues could have far-reaching consequences for an entire nation. One might argue that many of the eccentricities and unpredictable behaviors of certain historical monarchs could in part be attributed to their incredibly tangled family trees. While it's always difficult to definitively diagnose historical figures from afar, and mental health was certainly not understood in the same way it is today, the patterns of behavior, the sudden fits of rage, the periods of profound melancholy, and the instances of questionable judgment sometimes align with what we now understand about the consequences of extreme inbreeding. Because if you're doubling down on recessive genes for physical traits, why wouldn't you also be doubling down on recessive genes that might affect mental well-being? One prominent example that often comes to mind when discussing royal madness is King George III of Great Britain. He reigned during a tumultuous period, losing the American colonies and dealing with the Napoleonic Wars, but he is perhaps most famous for his recurring bouts of what was described as madness. These episodes involved periods of confusion, paranoia, agitation, and sometimes even inappropriate behavior. He would experience delusions, speak incoherently, and sometimes suffer from convulsions. It sounds rather dramatic, doesn't it? A king losing his mind in front of his court. For a long time, the prevailing theory was that King George III suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that can cause neurological and psychological symptoms. The theory gained traction due to the discovery of high levels of arsenic in samples of his hair, which some believed could have been used in medical treatments that exacerbated the porphyria. However, more recent research has suggested that while he may have had some form of porphyria, his symptoms are also highly consistent with bipolar disorder. Now, while King George III's madness might not be directly a result of extreme inbreeding in the same way as Charles II's physical ailments, it does highlight the vulnerability of royal lines to inherited conditions, whether physical or mental. And while the Hanoverian dynasty, to which George III belonged, wasn't as notoriously inbred as the Habsburgs, there were still instances of cousin marriages within their lineage, because, as we've established, the lives of these dysfunctional monarchs weren't just series of bad decisions. They were often operatic displays of what happens when absolute power meets absolute boredom or absolute insecurity. When your every whim is treated as a command from God, the line between eccentric and dangerously unhinged gets very thin. So let's float over to a particularly messy example from the 18th century, Christian VII of Denmark. Now, Christian is a prime candidate for the "how did this happen" category of history. He became king in 1766 at the age of 16, and it was clear from the start that the lights were on but nobody was home. Or, if they were busy rearranging the furniture in a very confusing way. Christian was rumored to have suffered from schizophrenia, but his behavior was also exacerbated by a childhood that was, frankly, a bit of a nightmare. His governor believed that the best way to raise a king was through hardening him, which mostly involved frequent beatings and psychological torment. Surprise, surprise, it didn't produce a stable leader. Christian's brand of dysfunction was particularly loud. He was known for roaming the streets of Copenhagen at night, picking fights with the watchmen, smashing windows, and frequenting the city's less reputable establishments. Imagine being a commoner just trying to get through the night, and the King of Denmark suddenly tries to start a bar brawl with you. It's a bit much. Inside the palace, things weren't much better. He'd jump over chairs during important meetings, throw food at his advisors, and once even reportedly turned his dining room into a makeshift gymnasium while his court tried to discuss state affairs. Because he was clearly incapable of ruling, his life became a battleground for people who wanted to rule through him. Enter his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. Now, Struensee is a character. He realized the king was essentially a child in a man's body, so he used his influence to become the de facto ruler of Denmark, and in a classic doubling down on the drama move, he also started an affair with the queen, Caroline Matilda. For a few years, Denmark was basically run by the king's doctor and the king's wife, while Christian himself played with his dogs or practiced his gymnastics. It was a royal soap opera of the highest order, ending, as these things often did, with a coup, an execution, and a lot of very stressed-out Danish nobles. But Denmark didn't have a monopoly on royal meltdowns. Let's look at a different flavor of dysfunction, one involving a very specific kind of emotional intensity. We have to talk about Juana of Castile, often unkindly remembered as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. Now, history has been a bit mean to Juana. Was she actually mad, or was she just a woman with a very intense personality trapped in a world of men who desperately wanted her throne? It's probably a bit of both, but the result was a life of tragic isolation. Juana was the daughter of the famous Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Yes, the ones who sent Columbus off on his travels. She was brilliant, highly educated, and, unfortunately for her, the heir to a massive empire. She married Philip the Handsome. There's that irony again. He was handsome, but also a bit of a jerk. Juana was utterly, obsessively devoted to him. When Philip died young, Juana didn't exactly handle the grief in a quiet and dignified royal manner. The stories say she refused to let his body be buried. She allegedly traveled across Spain with his coffin, opening it occasionally to kiss the feet of her deceased husband. Whether this was true or just propaganda spread by her father and son to keep her locked away is still debated, but it worked. She was confined to a windowless room in a castle for decades, while her father and then her son ruled in her name. It's a sad, quiet kind of dysfunction, a life spent in a literal and metaphorical shadow because her emotions were deemed too unruly for a monarch. Then, we have the monarchs who weren't necessarily mad in the medical sense, but were just profoundly, spectacularly bad at their jobs because they were obsessed with things that had nothing to do with ruling. Take Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king. Ludwig was the ultimate escapist. He hated the grit and grime of 19th century politics. He didn't want to sign treaties or review troop movements. He wanted to live in a Richard Wagner opera. Ludwig spent the Bavarian national treasury building incredibly elaborate, over-the-top castles like Neuschwanstein, the one that inspired the Disney castle. He lived in a dream world, often sleeping during the day and wandering his castles at night, dressed in historical costumes. He even had a disappearing dining room built so he wouldn't have to see or speak to his servants while he ate. He'd just sit there, alone in a shimmering grotto, eating dinner while the table rose through the floor. It sounds lovely, honestly, but when you're a king and your country is being swallowed up by the growing power of Prussia, it's not exactly the most functional approach to leadership. Eventually, his ministers had him declared insane, mostly so they could stop him from spending every cent in the treasury on more turrets and swan-shaped chairs. It's a recurring theme, isn't it? These figures were often ill-equipped for the roles they were forced into. They were born into a system that demanded they be symbols of strength and stability, yet their own lives were often marked by profound instability. Whether it was Christian VII's tantrums, Juana's grief, or Ludwig's castles, these monarchs show the human cost of a system that prioritizes bloodlines over competence. Let's move back a bit, further into the drafty corridors of the medieval world, to look at the children who never quite made it to the stage of dysfunctional adult, because they were too busy just trying to survive the nursery. We've talked about the big names, the emperors and the conquerors, but what about the little royals? The ones who were draped in ermine before they could crawl and were technically lords of vast territories while they were still losing their baby teeth. The life of a medieval royal child was a bizarre contradiction. On one hand, you were the most important person in the room. On the other hand, you were essentially a piece of property. Your diet was controlled, your movements were restricted, and your health was a matter of state concern. If a royal toddler got a stomachache, it wasn't just a bad night for the parents. It was a crisis that involved the court physicians, several priests, and probably a few worried letters to the Pope. And speaking of diet, let's talk about how these children were fed. It was widely believed that the quality of a child's character could be influenced by their wet nurse. If a royal mother didn't nurse her own child, which was common as she needed to be available to produce the next heir, a wet nurse was chosen with the scrutiny usually reserved for selecting a prime minister. They wanted a woman who was healthy, yes, but also temperate and godly, because they literally thought her personality would travel through the milk. If the nurse was a bit of a gossip, the future king might grow up to be a chatterbox. If she liked a glass of ale too much, well, heaven help the dynasty. But despite the best nurses and the finest silks, royal nurseries were often remarkably sad places. Because of the high infant mortality rate we discussed earlier, parents sometimes kept an emotional distance from their children. It was a defense mechanism. When you have 10 children and only 3 make it to adulthood, you don't necessarily want to get too attached to the ones who look a bit peaky. This led to a strange, isolated upbringing. These kids were often raised in separate households, away from the main court, surrounded by adults whose job was to serve them, but not necessarily to love them. They were spoiled in the sense that they had every material comfort, but they were starved of the kind of normal, messy human interaction that makes for a well-adjusted person. Consider the case of Henry VI of England. He became king when he was only 9 months old. Imagine that for a second. A literal baby sitting on a throne, or more likely being held on one, while the most powerful men in the country knelt before him. He was the most spoiled child in Europe. He had his own tiny suits of armor and miniature crowns, but he was also the loneliest. He grew up in a world where no one was his equal. He had no friends, only subjects. This total isolation often led to a specific kind of royal spoiling, where the child grew up believing the entire world was a stage built specifically for them. They weren't just kids, they were icons, and when you treat a child like a sacred icon, they don't exactly learn how to deal with disappointment or the word no. This is how you end up with teenage kings who execute their tutors because they didn't like their Latin lessons. And let's not forget the sickly part of the equation. We've talked about the big genetic issues, but even everyday hygiene was a disaster. Royal children were often kept indoors in drafty stone palaces, protected from bad air. They were rarely allowed to run around outside like normal kids because it was unseemly and dangerous. This lack of sunlight and fresh air, combined with a diet that was often heavy on meat and light on anything green, meant that royal children were frequently victims of rickets or scurvy. You have the richest children in the world, yet they're pale, bowed-legged, and lose their teeth because no one understands they need a bit of vitamin C and some sunshine. The pressure to perform was also intense. A royal child had to be a miniature adult. They were expected to sit still through 4-hour church services, to receive foreign ambassadors with dignity, and to never, ever show weakness. If a 5-year-old prince cried during a ceremony, it was seen as a sign of a feeble nature. It's no wonder so many of them grew up to be the dysfunctional monarchs we love to talk about. Their childhoods were a pressure cooker of expectation and isolation. They were told they were gods, but they were treated like fragile porcelain. They were surrounded with wealth, but lived in constant fear of a simple cold. As we float through these stories, it becomes clear that the golden age of royalty wasn't so golden if you were the one actually living it. Whether you were a woman being silenced by a metal bridle, a king with a jaw that didn't fit his face, or a child king who was technically the master of millions but couldn't choose his own breakfast, the reality was often one of quiet, persistent discomfort. So let's take a deep breath. The lights are low, the world is quiet, and those iron bridles and drafty stone nurseries are far, far away in the past. We can leave the Habsburgs to their portraits and the boy kings to their miniature crowns. The stories continue, drifting like smoke through the centuries. But for night, we've traveled far enough.